In chapter 5, we will talk about Freud's contemporary, another theorist, Alfred Adler. As you may read through the chapter, you find that Adler believed people are not driven by dark instincts they can't control. If you go back and compare with Sigmund Freud, Adler held very different view, even though he was a student or colleague of Sigmund Freud. Instead, Adler saw that humans as goal-directed, socially embedded beings who are striving to find our place in the world. He's arguably the most optimistic of the major theorists, and in many ways, the most cultural. As you may see that Adler provided a non-judgmental space for exploration, self-exploration, and allow clients to experience life fully. This is the way to set the tone of his approach, collaborative, humanistic, and strength-based. And these are some questions I normally ask at the beginning to provide students, whether if you look at the student manual, some knowledge check, you will find these questions are curious, right? Adler chose the name individual psychology for his therapeutic approach. That is true. The term individual comes from the Latin individuum, meaning indivisible or whole. He wanted to study the whole people, whole person, not reduce them to drives or parts. If you remember Freud, deriving from or talking about libido, life and death instinct, etc. The second statement is not true. Striving for superiority is universal and healthy. It becomes neurotic only when misdirected toward personal dominance over others rather than contribution to community. In other sense, superiority complex becomes a problem. Inferiority complex becomes a problem. And the third statement is true. It emphasized the client's subjective social context, making it one of the most culturally responsive classical approach. And the fourth statement is not true. Adler disagrees with Freud here. It's how we interpret and respond to childhood experience that matters, not the experience themselves. And the next one is also not true. The relationship is central, collaborative, egalitarian, and encouraging. And the last statement is correct, where you see social interest is the best Adlerian contribution. We will find that more in later slides, that Adler's most distinctive and enduring concept. Alfred Adler was a Viennese physician who co-founded the psychoanalytic movements and then resigned to develop his own approach after clashing with Freud's overemphasis on sexuality. And if you think of how they vary from one another in the chart, in the table you see that where Freud was more focused on sexual or aggressive instinct, sounded somewhat pessimistic and deterministic, and also focused more on interpsychic conflict. Whereas Adler, he based his theory from social striving, meaning making, optimistic and growth oriented. He wanted to interpret how respond matters more than how we interpret the experience, and also social context and goals. If you think of a child who grows up in poor and respond to poverty by feeling permanently inferior and withdrawing, or by developing intense drive and ambition. Same in circumstances, different meaning, right? So a child might respond to their state of poverty as inferior and withdrawn, versus someone can use them as a strong drive for ambition. And you may find many examples in our society. Adler says that interpretation is what shapes personality, not the event itself. And if you also think of multicultural aspect, Adlerian therapy is uniquely well suited for diverse population because it encourages clients to define themselves within their social and cultural context, not according to universal norms imposed by therapists. This is Adler's central insight about human motivation, and you often may confuse with inferiority feeling with clinical inferiority complexes that I mentioned earlier. Inferiority feeling is normal and healthy. Every human being's life begins life small, helpless, and dependent. Think of our early childhood experience. This creates universal experience of felt minus, right? Smallness, awareness of being less capable than we wanted to be. This is the engine of all human development. Without it, we wouldn't try. Now, if you think of a toddler who falls within learning to walk, doesn't feel permanently inferior. They feel the gap between where they are and where they wanted to be. The feeling is what drives them to stand up again. Falling does not lead to giving up. So inferiority feelings are literally how the human species grow, according to Adler. When does it become a problem? Well, inferiority feeling becomes fixed, similar to what Freud mentioned about fixation, and overwhelming. That is inferiority complex. The person gives up striving and compensates in unhealthy ways, bullying, withdrawing, exaggerating, or over grandiose self-importance. On the other hand, the superiority feeling, which is also striving for significance. This is not arrogance. It's the healthy drive toward mastery, contribution, and overcoming obstacles. Adler called it striving for superiority, or later, striving for perfection. It motivates by social interest, not personal dominance. Let me ask a question here. One of the most important and significant contribution Adler made is social interest. It's Adler's most important and original contribution. Many of we confuse that being outside or likable. We need to clarify that it's a philosophical attitude toward humanity. So what does it mean, social interest? It's sense of identification with and belonging to the human community, right? That we feel connected to family, friends, and so on. And express through genuine concern for the welfare of others. Social interest as a measurement of our mental well-being is an important aspect. Adler believed that psychological health is measured by the degree to which a person is contributing to the common good, not by symptom reduction alone. This contributed later to recovery model in psychotherapy. If you think of an example, a client who is severely depressed often withdraws completely from social connection. They stop contributing, stop feeling part of anything larger than themselves. Adlerian therapy would see this not as mere symptom, but as disconnection from social interest. Healing means re-engaging with the community, right? Think of someone you consider psychologically healthy, not happy all the time, but genuinely healthy. What role does social interest play in how they live? That should be a very important way to think about, this social interest. We as people continue to derive identity through our contribution. Our sense of belonging comes from how much we give, and our interest is continue to grow that we are contributing something in return to the community. Here, Adler identified 3 universal life tasks that every person must address. They are not optional, they are built into the structure of human existence. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when I talk about these theories, I may sound like the practitioner of that theory. That helps me to stay with the role. So bear with me. This is not my view. I'm trying to explain these theories as if I'm the practitioner, I'm the theorist of this particular subject. So 3 life tasks you may think of, building friendship, which could be a social task, and the capacity of genuine cooperative relationship with others, not just acquaintances. It is social task that we live for, right? And maybe that's why we have this term called, we are social animals. Number 2, establishing intimacy. That could be not just marriage, any kind of romantic relationship. The ability to form deep, committed partnership that requires vulnerability and mutual respect. Number 3, contributing to society, your occupational task, finding meaningful work that serves others, not just earn money. Now, these are the 3 goals, 3 tasks that we come with, and we strive to achieve them, right? If you think of client's Adlerian assessment question is, what would you do if you were quite well? That's a very important question Adler would ask. And the question of the question, right? Or miracle question before solution-focused therapy was mentioned, what client is avoiding by staying symptomatic? So what would your life look like if you did not have the problem that you're struggling with? Well, that would be a really good way to ask a question. If a client says that I would go back to work, you know that the occupational life's task is the battleground. The symptom may be maintaining avoidance of work, and Adler may explore what is about work that produces anxiety, what early conviction underlies this, right? So you're trying to find out, it's a miracle question, it's from solution focus, but it's actually, you see a lot in Adler's approach. Another interesting concept that you see in Adler is birth order and sibling, or birth order and sibling relationship. There's another one we'll talk about in a minute. So birth order is one of the Adler's most widely known and unique, but also misunderstood contribution. The key is that birth order describes psychological position, not autonomic destiny. There are 5 of them, as you see in the list here. So in terms of positioning, psychological positioning, the oldest one, typically dethroned when younger siblings arrive. Now, many before authoritarian many may become authoritarian, may become more responsible, may have high achieving goal, strong sense of power and entitlement early on. And the second of 2 feels perpetually in a race with the firstborn, often develops contrasting personality, maybe rebellious or competitive, because now you are competing with another sibling. And I enjoy doing activity on this particular topic in my in-person class. I ask students to see if that positioning is accurate about themselves. And more often than not, I have heard students agree with this description. So to me, it's a really interesting technique when you're working with your client, trying to get a little more detail, right? So middle child, that means about 3 children. The middle one may feel squeezed out, often the most socially skilled, had to negotiate with both older and younger ones, and can feel overlooked. And I joke about my position, I'm the middle child, so it does fit well with my life experience in many ways. Youngest child, often pampered, may be creative and charming, but may struggle with self-reliance, typically because they're dependent on family members, parents, or other older siblings, right? So that could be true for if you have 3 or 2 children, the youngest one typically. The only child raised primarily among adults, may be mature, but less practice in peer negotiation, comfortable with authority, but may struggle with sibling-type peer conflict. Now, if you're only child, I want you to take a moment and think about, what is your position in your sibling relationship? Are these feel true to you? And it doesn't need to be, and it shouldn't be. And if it does, then that would be a nice way of exploring your client's experience. Now, there are some critical caveats, right? Birth order is a starting point for exploration, not a diagnosis. Always explore how the client subjectively experienced their position. That's what shapes their personality, not the position itself. So think about this. Again, I would do this more in an engaging way, but I want you to take a pause and sort of give a couple thoughts. What does this look like in your world? An Adlerian approach, there is the fundamental goal is to encouragement, right? The therapeutic goal is to encouragement, but which Adler considered the most powerful therapeutic intervention. And if you think of the definition, not empty praise, but a genuine communication of belief in the client's worth, capabilities, and potential, regardless of whether they succeed or fail. That is encouragement. And why do we need to encourage? Well, Adler believed that all psychological dysfunction stems from disencouragement, the belief that one cannot contribute meaningfully or belong. Therapy is fundamentally an act of re-encouraging the client, right? And if you think of how do we do that? Well, we might need to look into some of the areas we'll see in application. So there are 4 therapeutic goals, and I'm using a different computer today, so I can't write. So I'll try to write. Foster social interest and community feeling, right? Help client overcome disencouragement and recognizing their resources. Change the client's faulty perception and goal, like lifestyle. Redirect motivation toward the useful side of their life. Now here's an example. If you ask somebody who would quit every project before completing and tells themselves, I'm not smart enough, is a sign of discouragement. And Adler would not challenge the thought like CBT. What are some evidence that you have to think that you are not capable? Rather, Adler would explore the early life conclusion that produced it and use the therapeutic relationship itself as a corrective experience of encouragement. It's slightly different from what you see in CBT, like cognitive behavior therapy. Now, in terms of applying this technique, the whole purpose is to encouragement, right? So there are a few phases that you see. If you look at this phase, you will find the flexibility is important. It's not so rigid, but it gives you structure, right? The phase 1 is establishing the relationship. It's pretty common in any therapeutic relationship, right? So collaborative, not an expert-driven. Therapists help client identify strength and asset, not just problems. And the goal here is to build a person-to-person connection before diagnosing. And phase 2 is slightly more. You may conduct subjective interview where you ask open-ended question to explore, is there anything else I should know to understand you? And you may have objective interview where you try to take some structured intake, history, family role, family rules, right? Some of the private logic, you saw that term, basic mistakes, that's some of the assumptions they may have. They may also look at the family constellation, who is in family, birth order, family atmosphere, parental message. So you see that in second phase, you gather a lot of information. And early recollection, what is your earliest memory? And you try to tell me something that happened one time when you were young. The specific memory client retains are not random. They reflect current lifestyle and conviction. That's interesting to know. When you think of, right, what do you remember from your early childhood? Basic mistakes, I think I mentioned that, right? Some of the private logic or personal logic. There are core belief, like we see in CBT, the faulty ones, they may have been overly generalized, right? And people will always let me down. That's like a core belief. I must be perfect to be loved. That's, again, CBT call it core belief, but Adler calls it basic mistakes. And if you think of applying this part or early recollection, if a client's early memory is of being left alone in a store and feeling terrified, this likely reflects a persistent life theme around abandonment. A client whose earliest memory involves winning a competition may be revealing an achievement-driven lifestyle. So this early recollection gives you really important preview, or at least post view maybe of the client. And phase 3, you see that encouraging self-understanding and insight. Therapist offers interpretation tentatively, not like Freud, but you might offer some insight, right? And you might identify hidden goals and purpose that is not fully been made aware. Now I want to pause and I want you to think about Adler. Adler was Freud's contemporary, so unconscious influence was still there. That's why you see that, understanding your goal, and you also see that in current therapy practice. People don't necessarily talk about unconsciousness, but you try to make connection between your experience and your underlying thoughts and beliefs. So that's like basically unconsciousness, right? So that's what you try to do. You try to provide that self-understanding and maybe give perspective, right? That's what happens. And client begins to see the coherence of their lifestyle, how it made sense then. But it's now, it's starting to understand there's a limitation now. So that is the phase 3. And the last phase is very important. It's more action oriented. where you look at or reorientation and re-education, putting insight into practice. Clients are encouraged to taking a situation, as if, right, and they were already the person they wanted to be. And goals are reduced from self-serving to socially useful. So that's like a fourth phase. You provide education, you provide orientation, and try to use that encouragement in this phase. Let me ask a question. As you see, there are many techniques that Adler introduced in psychotherapy. It could be overwhelming, but their core techniques applied with, here some examples. Avoiding the traps, identifying self-defeating patterns in clients' lifestyle. If people constantly make excuse, you're trying to identify their private logic or personal logic is faulty. Confrontation, pointing out discrepancies between stated goals and actual behavior. For example, you say that you want connection, but you cancel plans every time someone gets close. So that could be a nice way of, again, gentle way of confronting, right? Early recollection analysis, that you talk about early experience, what they remember, and try to see if there's any other themes associated with it. Lifestyle assessment, the comprehensive evaluation of birth order, family atmosphere, basic mistakes, and early recollection. Encouragement is the foundational intervention, right? You try to identify explicit belief in the client's capacity. And interesting one I put in red font here is acting as if you were already the confident person you would be, even for one day. Notice what changes. What do you think? This is, again, almost similar to experiment, like act as if you don't have anxiety anymore. You are a healthy person. What would your day look like? So that would be one way to engage client. Catching oneself, developing self-awareness of one's old pattern are used, and then try to change that. Push button technique is another interesting one. Client alternates between pleasant and unpleasant memories to demonstrate that they can choose how to feel. Remember, it's about choice, right? Emphasizing emotional self-determination. Paradoxical intention is prescribe the symptoms, ask the client to deliberately do more of the problem behavior, which is also kind of making aware about the problem behavior, and it loses the power. It's almost like you're trying to be mindful of your pain. I practice that. When you be mindful of your pain itself, the pain is less prominent. Same way in a paradoxical intervention. Paradoxical intention. Task setting and homework. This is very old technique that behavior therapy now adopted. You assign specific behavior to practice, and sometimes using humor. So those are some of the techniques that you see. And I also have seen this metta meditation. It's not necessarily Adler. It's, again, from my background, I know it's a Buddhist practice. You try to genuinely and intentionally practice sharing loving kindness. That's what metta means, loving kindness toward others. So it's intentional. It's a practice that done with verbal, done with your word, and done with your action. And Adler actually used the therapeutic technique in many settings. As you can see, it shows that Adler's contribution is now psychotherapy is used in child guidance and parenting counseling. Adler himself founded Child Guidance Clinic in Vienna. He was one of the first to work with children's behavior in a family systems context. Couple counseling. The love task is central to Adler's work. Power struggles in relationship are analyzed through social interest and lifestyle capability. Group counseling is another one. You try to identify what is your community task, right? Social task. And you try to find what direction you should go. Cultural conflict, identify the contextual behaviors, and also try to navigate cultural identity conflicts. And correctional office and rehabilitation counseling. Encouragement and redirection toward meaningful contribution is addressed, and try to identify lifestyle patterns that often underlie criminal behaviors. and many other mental health institutions. So if you think of this, right, take a minute and write down, do you see any recurring patterns in your life, in your relationship, achievement, conflict? Can you trace any of these themes back to your childhood? What are the early convictions that you have started the pattern? So that should help you to identify what are your lifestyle concepts, like inferiority feeling, birth order, early recollection, and basic mistakes. Let me ask you a question. Even we praise a lot for Adler's contribution, every theory has its own critique and shortcoming. Here are some limitations. Individualistic locus of change. If you think of placing responsibility for change on the individual client, can feel invalidating to clients who face real systemic oppression. Telling a person experiencing structural racism that their response to the discrimination is what matters and can minimize the oppression itself. And I think of what we deal with current administration and people of color, minority populations, if their experience is, if you were to tell it's your reaction or your feeling toward those experience, would be definitely not very welcomed. Exploring childhood and family, this is not open to all culture backgrounds, right? You don't explore certain people might not be comfortable. Some clients may find this intrusive, shameful, and simply culturally unfamiliar. And collaborative versus expert stance, some clients might find that clients from culture that values authoritative expertise may be dissatisfied with an egalitarian collaborative therapist. Think of I have experience working with Asian background, individuals from Asian culture. When they come to therapy, they tend to talk less and expect more from the therapist, as if you're visiting a doctor. And I have a practice of giving them some coping strategy, because it's always a norm. They want you to offer something to take with them, almost like a prescription, right? With that, I hope there are some important messages that you learn in this chapter, that Alfred Adler's contribution to psychotherapy.